Being wealthy in the ancient world was a theater of being seen, a performance so constant it blurred the line between living and acting. Imagine opening your eyes to the sound of servants quietly preparing your bath, warm water and scented oils already filling the air. Outside your window, a vineyard stretches as far as the eye can see, and somewhere in the distance, a man you own is weeding it. But being wealthy in antiquity meant something profoundly different from what it means today, a completely different relationship with existence itself. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about power, performance, fear, and the constant, exhausting theater of being seen. For a wealthy Roman senator in 100 AD, the day began early, not because he had to, but because power in Rome was transactional, social, and relentless. Every morning, hundreds of clients, people who depended on his political favor, would line up outside his home before dawn. This ritual was called the salutatio, a morning audience, like a very small king holding court while still in his robe. The senator would walk through this crowd of anxious, flattering humans, granting requests and making promises as he went. He dispensed small gifts called sportuli, little baskets of food or coins, and generally enjoyed the spectacle of people being very, very nice to him. And if you were rich enough, your crowd could number in the thousands every single morning. Today, we call that a follower count. In Rome, they called it influence. Meanwhile, his wife, if she came from a wealthy family herself, was undergoing her own ritual. Hair was architecture in Roman aristocracy. A skilled ornatrix, a specialized female slave dedicated entirely to hair and makeup, could spend hours constructing the elaborate curled and pinned towers that fashion demanded. Pliny the Elder complained bitterly about the time women spent on their appearance. Pliny the Elder also wrote 37 volumes of natural history in his spare time. Rich Egyptian nobles in the New Kingdom had a similarly theatrical morning. Makeup was not vanity, it was spiritual protection. The kohl around their eyes wasn't just cosmetic. It was believed to ward off the evil eye, infections, and the general malice of the universe. So, putting on your face in ancient Egypt was technically a religious act, which means spending 45 minutes in front of a mirror every morning was not self-indulgence, it was piety. Wealthy Mesopotamians in Babylon had their own morning obligations. A rich merchant or palace official would begin his day with a prayer. Not a private, quiet murmur, but a formal, structured invocation directed at a personal god. Every wealthy Babylonian had one. A personal deity assigned specifically to you and your household, whose full-time job was to advocate for your interests in the divine bureaucracy. Every wealthy Babylonian had a personal god, assigned specifically to their household, whose full-time job was advocating for their interests in the divine bureaucracy. If things were going badly for a wealthy Babylonian, it was probably because your personal god had stepped away from his desk in the divine bureaucracy. The solution to a disengaged personal god? More offerings, more rituals, more expense. Keeping the divine bureaucracy happy was a constant financial drain. Being rich in ancient Babylon meant maintaining a relationship with your own private god, the most ancient form of networking ever recorded, or the most expensive subscription service in history. The homes of the ancient wealthy were not just places to sleep. They were statements, arguments made in stone about who you were, how much you mattered, and how thoroughly everyone else should respect you. A wealthy Roman's domus was designed with this purpose explicitly in mind. Every architectural choice was a calculated display of status and power. You entered through a narrow corridor that opened dramatically into an atrium, a large central hall with a rectangular pool in the floor, open to the sky above. Light flooded in from above, reflecting off the pool's surface, and everything was orchestrated to make your jaw drop at precisely the right moment. Everything was orchestrated to drop your jaw on cue. The atrium's design was a theatrical reveal, a statement of wealth and taste. Beyond the atrium was the tablinum, the master's office and reception room, where business was conducted and visitors were received. Then came the garden, the peristyle, surrounded by columns, filled with fountains and sculptures and plants arranged with obsessive precision. Surrounding the peristyle were the dining rooms, the libraries, the private baths, the kitchens, and the dozens of small, windowless, stuffy cells where the slaves slept. Surrounding the atrium, the tablinum, the peristyle garden, the dining rooms, the libraries, and the private baths were dozens of small, windowless, stuffy cells where the slaves slept. That last detail, the cramped, windowless slave cells, tends to get glossed over in travel brochures about Pompeii. Wealthy Greek homes, particularly in Athens during its golden age, were more restrained on the outside, deliberately so. Ostentation on the street was considered vulgar and socially dangerous. You didn't want to look too rich from the outside, but step through the door and the interior courtyard was a different world entirely. shaded, cool, decorated with fine pottery and bronze work. Mesopotamian elites, particularly in Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar II, lived in multi-story mud brick palaces with private water systems. These palaces featured cooling towers, roof gardens, and private water systems, a reflection of elite engineering under Nebuchadnezzar II. The so-called Hanging Gardens of Babylon, whether they existed exactly as described or not, reflect an actual culture of elite landscaping that was absolutely real. Because if you have enough slaves and enough engineering knowledge, you can make water go uphill. And if you can make water go uphill, you will absolutely do it. Just to prove that you can, the decorative details inside these homes were where the real money went. Roman walls were covered in elaborate painted frescoes, not just pretty pictures, but entire mythological narratives. Trompe l'oeil architecture was a favorite trick. Painted columns and windows that made rooms look larger, and detailed landscape paintings called topia that depicted idealized garden scenes. The walls of the richest Roman homes weren't just decorated with random pretty pictures. They were covered in topia, elaborate, idealized landscape paintings showing perfect garden scenes, complete with birds, fountains, and lush greenery that probably didn't exist outside the villa's actual garden. If you could afford it, every wall in your house depicted a better world, a world of perpetual summer, architectural perfection, and lounging gods. The frescoes weren't just decoration, they were a daily escape into a reality where nothing ever wilted, no one ever aged, and the sun always shone at the perfect angle. The message was unmistakable. The man who lives here has transcended the ordinary. He doesn't just inhabit the world, he curates it. Every fresco, every column, every imported marble slab was a statement carved in stone and pigment. I am not like you, I live in a different reality. Egyptian elites took a different approach to ceiling decoration in their homes and tombs. Painted ceilings mimicked the night sky. Deep blue backgrounds dotted with golden stars, constellations, and the occasional sacred bird. You could lie in bed and gaze up at a permanent, perfect starry night, even in the middle of the day. In the wealthy villas of Amarna, the floors told a different story. They were decorated with naturalistic paintings of plants and animals, lotus flowers, papyrus reeds, ducks, fish, all arranged so that walking across the room felt like strolling through a garden. The floor itself became a meadow you never actually stepped on. The ancient wealthy understood something fundamental. Your environment shapes your psychology, and if you have enough money, you can engineer your entire surroundings to tell you every single day that you are exceptional. The ceiling, the floor, the walls, all of it was a carefully constructed mirror, reflecting back your own importance. But nothing signaled status quite like food. In the ancient world, what you ate and how you ate it was the clearest possible marker of where you stood in the social hierarchy. A peasant's meal was a bowl of porridge eaten with the fingers. A rich man's meal was a spectacle that could last hours. A Roman banquet, the cena, was not a meal. It was a performance. Every dish was carefully orchestrated to arrive at the perfect moment, each course more elaborate than the last. The host's reputation depended on the evening's theatrical impact, not just the quality of the food. Guests didn't sit at these dinners. They reclined on couches arranged in groups of 3 around low tables. The arrangement was called a triclinium, literally 3 couches, and it meant you spent the entire meal lying on your side, propped on one elbow, reaching for food with the other hand. Sitting upright at a Roman dinner was a social faux pas of the highest order. Sitting was for servants and people who ate standing in the street, grabbing a quick meal from a thermopolium, the ancient equivalent of fast food. If you were important, you reclined, it was non-negotiable. Reclining meant you had arrived, literally and figuratively. It was the posture of a person who had nothing to prove and nowhere to rush, a body language that said, I am so secure in my status that I can afford to be horizontal while eating, surrounded by people who serve me. The food itself was designed to impress through rarity, complexity, and deliberate excess. The cookbook attributed to Apicius describes dishes like brain-stuffed dormice, flamingo tongue sauce, and fattened snails fed on milk until they were too large to retreat into their shells. Nothing was too strange or too labor-intensive. The cookbook attributed to Apicius describes dishes that sound like a fever dream, brain-stuffed dormice and flamingo tongue sauce. Snails were fattened on milk until they were too plump to retreat into their shells, a luxury of absurd proportions. Sea urchins were served in garum, the ubiquitous Roman fish sauce that went on absolutely everything, including other fish sauce. One of the most famous dinner parties was thrown by Trimalchio, a fictional nouveau riche freedman in Petronius' Satyricon. It's a satire but rooted in real Roman social behavior, where wealth demanded theatrical display at every meal. At Trimalchio's feast, a roast pig is cut open to reveal sausages and blood puddings inside. Mechanical contraptions lowered dishes from the ceiling, and zodiac signs were carved into the food. Trimalchio pretends to die so his guests can rehearse the funeral. This is a comedy written by a man who had been to enough real Roman banquets to know exactly what was being mocked. Wine at these events was a status meter, and the type you received told you exactly where you stood. Roman elites aged their wine, labeled it by vintage and vineyard, developing a snobbery that would feel entirely familiar. The best wines, Falernian, Cacuben, and Massic, cost extraordinary sums and were served at specific points in the meal. Cheaper wine at Roman banquets was heavily diluted with water, a practical necessity for the lower-ranked guests who received it, ensuring they stayed sober enough to be useful. The wine you received at a Roman dinner party was a precise indication of exactly how important your host thought you were. A silent social calculus served in a cup. One ancient source mentions a host who served 3 different qualities of wine to 3 different tiers of guests at the same table, a blatant performance of hierarchy. The guests at the bottom tier noticed. They always notice. In a world of rigid social performance, such slights were never forgotten and rarely forgiven. In ancient Egypt, wealthy tombs were decorated with detailed depictions of food, not just to show what the deceased had enjoyed in life, but to magically provide it in the afterlife. These images were not just decoration, they were believed to magically provide the deceased with an eternal feast, ensuring no hunger in the next world. The walls of elite tombs are essentially very expensive restaurant menus, listing every dish the wealthy Egyptian hoped to enjoy for eternity. Roasted oxen, piles of bread in dozens of varieties, figs, pomegranates, and beer in amphorae stacked ceiling high were all depicted in these tomb paintings. The ancient Egyptian wealthy were not particularly subtle about the fact that one of their primary concerns for this life and the next was making sure the good food kept coming. Wealthy Athenians had their own food culture centered around the symposium, a drinking party of extraordinary sophistication that was the heart of social and intellectual life. A symposium was not a conference, as the word now implies. It was a drinking party of extraordinary sophistication, where wine, debate, and art mingled freely. After the meal, wine was mixed in large craters, according to a ratio debated and decided by the group, a democratic ritual that set the tone for the evening. After the meal, the symposium began with philosophical debate, poetry recitation, music, and games. One popular game was Katabos, where participants flung the dregs of their wine cups at a target across the room. So at the height of Athenian civilization, the men who funded the Parthenon spent their evenings drinking wine and throwing leftovers at each other. History contains multitudes. Entertainment was not passive. It was participatory, physical, and often extremely bloody. The Roman elite did not merely watch gladiatorial combat, they hosted it. A private munus, a gladiatorial show sponsored by a wealthy individual, was one of the main ways Roman aristocrats performed their status and bought the loyalty of the public. The more lavish the show, the more beasts, gladiators, and spectacular deaths, the more political capital you accumulated. Julius Caesar, before he became the dictator, nearly bankrupted himself funding gladiatorial games. His father had left him 320 pairs of gladiators in silver armor. That was an inheritance. The Venatio, wild animal hunts staged in arenas, were another form of elite entertainment requiring extraordinary logistics. Exotic animals had to be captured in Africa or Asia, transported alive across the Mediterranean, and kept fed and healthy enough to perform. The supply chains required to produce a single afternoon of Roman entertainment in the late Republic would be considered ambitious logistics by modern standards. Wealthy Romans funded these spectacles and got their names inscribed on monuments for it. The transaction was explicit. You spend money, the public cheers, the public votes for you. You get power, you spend more money. Round and round it went, and the lions kept dying, and the crowds kept coming. Wealthy Greeks, particularly in Athens, sponsored theatrical festivals. The great tragedies of Sophocles and Aeschylus and the comedies of Aristophanes were funded by rich citizens called choregoi, who competed for the honor of sponsoring the most elaborate, best-performed play. Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Aristophanes wrote plays that were funded by these elites. Being the choregos whose play won the Dionysia Festival was a serious source of social prestige. Athens essentially crowdfunded high art through elite competition, which is a business model that honestly deserves more credit. Private entertainment at home was equally elaborate. Roman dinner parties routinely featured recitations of poetry, performances by musicians, acrobats, dwarves, and magicians. Dwarves were a specific status symbol in Rome, because keeping one as part of your household staff was a thing people did. Magicians and professional storytellers filled the silence. The wealthy of antiquity seem to have had a deep horror of silence. Filling every moment of leisure with stimulation, poetry, music, acrobats, dwarves, and professional storytellers at dinner parties. Chariot racing illustrated how ancient entertainment and wealth intersected. The great racing factions of Rome were funded by wealthy patrons as a form of political branding. The blues, greens, reds, and whites, each faction had its own wealthy patron, its own stables, and fanatical supporters who wore their colors like modern sports fans. These factions had devoted fan bases that modern football clubs can only dream about. Riots broke out between blues and greens, and emperors themselves openly supported one faction. The Circus Maximus could hold 250,000 spectators, a massive arena built for the spectacle of speed, skill, and sometimes death, all funded by the elite. Successful charioteers were the ancient equivalent of modern sports celebrities, adored by the public, lavishly rewarded, and used as instruments of political branding by their patrons. A famous charioteer named Gaius Appius Diocles reportedly earned the equivalent of $5 billion over his career, a fortune that made him one of the richest athletes in history. His patron was very pleased with this return on investment. Sponsoring a winning charioteer was a reliable way to turn silver into political influence. Being rich in antiquity meant your body was a project, and that project required an army of slaves, specialists, and attendants dedicated to your physical maintenance. Roman baths, the thermae, were public gathering places, but the truly wealthy had private baths in their homes, multiple rooms designed for a complete bathing ritual. A private bath had a cold pool, a warm room, a hot room, a massage room, and a room for depilation, all performed by specialized slaves whose entire existence was organized around your body. Perfumed oils were applied after bathing, hair was treated, nails were cared for, all of it performed on your body by other humans whose entire existence was organized around the maintenance of yours. The strigil, a curved metal tool, was used to scrape oil, sweat, and dirt from the skin after exercise. Slaves performed the scraping on athletes after their workouts, a routine part of elite body maintenance. The scrapings, grime mixed with oil from a famous athlete's body, were sold in small flasks as a kind of ancient celebrity merchandise. People rubbed gladiator sweat residue on themselves for luck, beauty, or status, the ancient equivalent of buying a signed jersey. Wealthy Roman women used face creams made from barley flour, eggs, ground antler, and narcissus bulbs. Face masks made from crocodile dung were also used. The physician Galen recommended them for the skin. Preparations of crushed pearls dissolved in vinegar were another costly beauty treatment. Cleopatra famously bathed in donkey milk for her skin, a practice that required extraordinary resources. This required the daily milking of between 200 and 700 donkeys, an immense logistical effort. Egyptian records suggest Cleopatra actually traveled with her own herd of donkeys for this purpose. The wealthy also used their bodies differently in public. Posture, gait, and the way they wore their toga all communicated status. Rich Romans walked slowly and deliberately. Rushing was for those who had places they needed to be, not for those who had arrived. Arrived meant moving like you had nowhere you needed to be. Rushing was for people with places they had to go. If you had truly arrived, you walked slowly and deliberately, every gesture a performance of having already reached the destination that mattered. The toga itself was wearable proof of status, a 6-meter woolen semicircle that had to be folded and draped just so. It was essentially architecturally dependent on assistance. Nobody could put on a toga alone. The garment was architecturally dependent on assistance, which was, of course, entirely the point. It was a visible, wearable statement that you had people to help you get dressed in the morning. But here is something that tends to get lost in all the luxury. Being rich in the ancient world was terrifying, not in the way poverty was terrifying, but wealth in antiquity was acutely structurally unstable. There was no limited liability, no bankruptcy protection, no diversified portfolio managed by professionals. If your ship sank, you were ruined. If you fell out of political favor, your property could be confiscated. If the emperor decided he liked your house was gone. If you died intestate in Rome, your entire estate could dissolve into legal chaos. The wealthy of antiquity were extremely aware of how quickly everything could disappear. They were extremely aware of how quickly everything could disappear. This is partly why they were so obsessed with display. Every banquet, every gift to clients, every sponsored game, every marble column, it wasn't just vanity, it was insurance. It was the constant purchase and maintenance of loyalty, patronage networks, political alliances, and social goodwill that just might protect you when things went wrong. The Roman writer Seneca, who was himself extraordinarily wealthy, and spent considerable time writing philosophical essays about why wealth didn't matter, noted with some irony that the rich were often the most anxious people he knew. They had more to lose, and they knew it. The Stoic philosophy that was so fashionable among Roman elites was in part a psychological technology for managing the specific stress of having everything in a world where everything could be taken. Wealthy ancient Egyptians dealt with this anxiety by spending their entire adult lives preparing for death. Building your tomb, stocking it, hiring priests to maintain the mortuary cult that would sustain your spirit after death. This was not morbidity, it was estate planning. The most important asset you owned in ancient Egypt was not your house or your land or your gold. It was your relationship with the afterlife administrators. The most important asset a wealthy Egyptian owned was not land, gold, or power, but a well-maintained relationship with the afterlife administrators, the divine bureaucrats who judged the soul. The tomb of Ramesses II cost the equivalent of what some modern nations spend on entire infrastructure projects, a monumental investment in securing a perfect afterlife. Ramesses II reigned for 67 years, and he was still adding to his tomb when he died at the age of 90. a lifetime of construction for a single eternal residence. But the deepest anxiety of all was the fear of social decline, the constant terror of falling from the top of the pyramid. A Roman senator who lost his fortune didn't just lose money, he lost his seat in the Senate, his clients, his mourning crowd, and his entire social identity. The Latin word for reputation, fama, was understood not as something you built once, but as something you maintained constantly at tremendous effort and expense, a fragile flame never left untended.